Welcome to this course in Stress Management Skills Training with Biofeedback and Mindfulness. I'm Glyn Blackett. I'm a health coach, or sometimes I call myself a mind fitness coach, and my aim is to help my clients overcome problems linked to stress and learn how to access emotional well-being and optimal performance. I do this by training and coaching my clients in what I call mind-body skills, by which I mean the ability to regulate your own mental and emotional states by regulating the body states or the physiological states that underpin them. I first began working with biofeedback professionally with clients around 2005, and over the time since then I've learned how to work with it as a tool and how to get the best out of it, and I've seen that it can help people to make real progress with stress-related issues. I created this course to support my clients, especially those who live at a distance from my office and who have either rented or bought biofeedback equipment for use at home. So the course is very much practically focused, and I'm very confident that if you put in the time and application needed to develop your mind-body skills, then you can benefit just as many others have. So in tackling stress-related problems, we first have to ask the question, what is stress? Well, it's one of those words that everyone sort of knows what it means, but for the sake of clarity, it's the experience of being pulled out of your mental comfort zone by events and circumstances. The source of stress is called a stressor. It might be taking an exam, or going to a party, or a job interview, or having a looming deadline, or an argument with somebody, or catching an infection. The sources of stress are both varied and individual. What matters perhaps more than the source of stress is our stress response, which is something that happens in the body as well as in the mind. Our stress response can feel uncomfortable and can have negative consequences. It can affect our performance and may even impact our health. So it's the stress response and its consequences that are chiefly the problem and what people seek help with. That said, clearly not all stress is harmful. Some people apparently thrive on stress, and something that can throw one person into abject terror might be joyfully embraced by someone else. The author Kelly McGonigal defines stress as what arises when something you care about is at stake, hinting that what counts is what the stress means to you. So later, we'll need to look at what exactly it is about stress that makes it harmful. But first, let's take a look at the specifics of the stress response, and I want to group them into two categories. Firstly, anxiety and other difficult or painful emotions. And secondly, fatigue or energy and motivation problems, or other issues that are a little more physical in nature. So these are the two classes of stress-related problems that the course is aiming to address. I'll say more about these. Anxiety is the main emotion associated with stress. It takes many forms, ranging from quite specific and context-dependent fears, such as phobias, to social anxiety and generalized anxiety. In the course, we're going to be looking at the specific and individual nature of anxiety. Panic is an extreme form of anxiety, often having quite clear physical or bodily expressions, such as hyperventilation, which we'll go into in some detail later in the course. Then worrying, which is thinking driven by anxiety, thinking about all the things that could go wrong or have gone wrong, or obsessing, thinking over and over the same thoughts. Very often people experience stress not as actual fear or as actual worry, but just as an agitated, busy mind, racing thoughts, inability to switch off. Often you're physically quite restless too. Related to this is insomnia. You can't settle down to sleep because your mind is still buzzing. Then there's anger and irritability, short temper, frustration, resentment, impatience. Then connected to emotions are cravings and addictions or habit problems, such as smoking, and of course a really common one, appetite control and weight management. The other category is fatigue and low energy, which again is so common these days. Related problems include low motivation or drive and procrastination. Brain fog, which is poor concentration and focus, inability to think clearly and to hold things in mind. Low mood and low self-esteem. And then there are a lot of stress-related physical symptoms such as headaches and IBS. In fact, almost any physical health condition can be made worse by stress. Often such low-grade health problems are accompanied by fatigue, though not necessarily. Fatigue is an interesting state because in some ways it's a physical state, but it's also partly emotional in nature, in the sense that it's an experience that's created by the brain in response to both physical and mental triggers. What distinguishes this second class of problem is that they're more pervasive, less dependent on some particular trigger, and also longer lasting. They're probably connected to more deep-rooted physical changes, and it's likely that they're connected to a later stage of the stress response. Collectively, we might call these symptoms burnout, which tends to be the result of stress lasting months or maybe even years. Probably the most definitive characteristics of burnout are fatigue, maybe insomnia of the early waking variety, and lack of resilience. Little things can upset you inordinately or leave you exhausted for hours or days afterwards. Burnout problems are often more challenging than the more acute signs of stress, and although the course content will focus more directly on the first category, the skills and resources that we'll work with are still very much relevant to burnout symptoms. But they are maybe not enough on their own. That's because fatigue and burnout can have many possible causal factors. I don't want to suggest that stress is the only one. And this brings me to an important disclaimer. I'm not a qualified medical practitioner, and I do not claim to offer treatment for any medical condition, including mental health conditions such as major depression. Nor am I trained to diagnose medical conditions. So my services are not an alternative to seeking medical help. So if you do have any physical symptoms, I recommend you get checked out by a doctor. Now, if you do have a medical problem, that doesn't mean that the course can't help you, it's just that you shouldn't think of it as a medical treatment. What the course will do is offer you tools for optimizing your health, optimizing the functioning of your brain and nervous system, and therefore of your mental and emotional well-being. You can also see it in terms of performance improvement training. You don't need to have any actual problems, but you might just want to get the best out of yourself. We've talked quite a bit about what the problems are. Now let's look at what the goals are. I like to express it in terms of developing resources, internal resources or skills. Things like stress resilience, which is the ability to cope with stressful events and their consequences, and to recover quickly and easily. I prefer this expression to stress reduction because the goal is not really to avoid stress or to prevent the stress response, which isn't really realistic, but rather to use the energy that's in the stress response productively. Emotional well-being, having a positive mood for at least most of the time, and having abundant willpower, motivation, and energy. These are 3 high-level resources, things that everyone would sign up for. We can drop down a level and get a more detailed view of what these resources specifically entail and list things like distress tolerance, or the ability to sit with or hold painful feelings without feeling overwhelmed, not getting reactive, not getting sucked in. There are lots of experiences we need to be tolerant of, such as anxiety or pain or cravings or uncertainty, not knowing what's going to happen, or things not going to plan, not getting what you expected or what you wanted. What they all share is that they make us feel uncomfortable, so that we want to get away from the experience. So more generally, being able to hold uncomfortable feelings is a really valuable resource. Another is the ability to quieten the mind, settle it down, still any agitation and restlessness, and also calm the body when it's over-aroused. If you can do that, you've got a much better chance of being able to focus clearly and think lucidly, creatively and productively. So what you would call optimal cognitive performance. The ability to enter a state of relaxed focus is just about universally useful. It's what we need in the face of stress. Who doesn't need it? Who doesn't need it to be at your best at work, whatever your job may be? Not just in work, but also leisure activities, from golf and other sports to arts and crafts, and even just simply reading or watching TV. And then the ability to access positive emotions, specific positive emotions like gratitude and appreciation, hope or interest. It's not just about getting rid of negative emotions like anxiety and irritability. Accessing positivity is an aspect of resilience, or the ability to quickly and easily recover from knockbacks. In a sense, these lower level resources are like component skills for the high level resources that I listed in the last slide. Also for more specific goals, for example, suppose you want to lose weight. That's going to take motivation and willpower. But what does that actually mean? Well, at some point you're going to experience cravings or impulses to eat inappropriately. You have to be able to tolerate these feelings. It's not realistic to think that they won't arise or that you'll just be able to get rid of them. Rather, you have to let them dissipate naturally. At the same time, it helps to be able to access positive motivation, hope, and anticipation of good feelings to come much further ahead. Now, earlier I mentioned mind-body skills, or the ability to regulate your body responses or your physiology. I hope that you can begin to at least get a glimpse of how such mind-body skills are involved at this lower level. For example, if you want to let go of cravings, you have to be able to let go of the arousal or activation that cravings tend to produce in the body. If we're looking to train and develop mind-body skills, then the foundation for the whole project is the mind-body connection, or the mind-body principle. This is simply the idea that your subjective experience is reflected in what your body is doing, how it's functioning. In other words, how you think, feel and act is reflected in your physiology. By physiology, I mean the set of processes going on in the body and also the brain, and also the communication systems that regulate body activity, that keep the body running within healthy bounds. The mind-body connection works both ways. Your physiological functioning affects your subjective experience, and how you think and feel affects your physiology. The mind-body connection is important for understanding what emotions fundamentally are. They're responses that help you to adapt to circumstances. We'll say more about this in Module 1. For now, let's just give some examples. Say you're walking home alone late one night when someone pulls a knife and asks you to hand over your money. Probably you'll have a fear response. Your heart pounds, your muscles go tight, or maybe they go to jelly. You freeze up. Or maybe you feel an urge to turn and run. If you do run, your fear is probably going to help you run faster. That's why it's called the fight or flight response. It's preparing your body for action. Another example. You're late for work one day and your boss calls you into his office. Since you've already been warned about being late, you have a similar response, fear. Your heart pounds and you tighten up. Another example. You're asked to give a presentation to a company meeting in a month's time. You don't like being the centre of attention at the best of times, and you hate the idea of standing in front of all the bosses. Again, you have a fear response with physical changes, maybe tightening up, maybe sweating, but this time maybe much milder because it's still a month away. Trouble is, you're still feeling the same later that night when you're in bed trying to get to sleep. So, 3 examples of stress, all sharing common features and all demonstrating the mind-body connection. Actually, the third one may be the most minor stress, unless you really hate public speaking. But it can cause the most trouble because it's extended in time. And the stress response doesn't have to feel like anxiety or fear to be a problem. A lot of low-level but ongoing stress can leave you stuck in an agitated, over-aroused state, unable to calm down, unable to sleep well, unable to focus properly and think clearly, and unable to enjoy the good things in life. For example, you have a deadline for a project that you're working on, and you're working long hours in order to meet that deadline. Even when you've finished for the day, you can find it hard to switch off and relax, turn your mind to other things. The main point here is that stress triggers a physiological change. That in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. I think there is such a thing as good stress, but it is a problem if it feels really uncomfortable, or if it happens too often, or if it goes on too long, or if you get stuck in some particular state and lack the flexibility to get out of it. Whatever the case, we can say that there are certain physiological patterns that are associated with problem states. Conversely, there are other physiological patterns that are associated with solutions, how you want to feel, the mental resources you want to be able to access. And what you need is the ability to guide your physiology away from the problem states and into the more favourable states, from which it's easier to access the resources and positive emotions that you want. So, the mind-body connection is the broad principle that we're working under. But how specifically does physiology change? What specific physiological patterns can be seen in problem states? And what other patterns in solution states or resource states? Well, in recent years, neuroscience has been discovering much about the way that the stress response works and the way that emotions work. And by drawing on this knowledge and leveraging this knowledge, we can find the most effective methods for stress management. This is where biofeedback comes in. Biofeedback is a tool. In itself, it's not a therapy or a treatment modality, it's a tool. It's the key tool for the course, and it's a tool for learning. Biofeedback is founded on the neuroscience of the mind-body connection. It's based on measuring aspects of physiology that are part of the mind-body connection. In other words, it's about measuring physiological parameters that change with your subjective state of mind. They respond to the triggers for stress and emotions. What's happening in the stress response, or more generally in emotional responses, is that the brain is detecting certain threats or challenges, or just events of emotional significance, and then it's sending signals out into the body that trigger physiological changes. So muscles tighten up, your heart pounds, your breathing changes. You could say these changes embody the stress response, or they embody emotional responses. Other parts of the brain are listening out for changes in body state, or for messages coming back to the brain from the body. This is the basis of feeling. Feelings, in turn, can trigger further responses in the brain, so creating a sort of feedback loop. At times, this can work against you by creating a negative spiral. So, for example, you have to deliver a presentation to the bosses at work, and as you stand up, you feel your heart lurch. Feeling this, you think to yourself you're going to look nervous in front of the bosses, and they're going to think that you can't really cut it. And that triggers a further body response, so maybe you start to blush, and so on. What we're doing with biofeedback is we're attempting to constructively influence this loop in order to break the negative spiral and take things in a more favourable direction. So in biofeedback, we're measuring physiological correlates or particular aspects of physiology that respond to stress and emotional triggers. Muscle tension is an example. We tend to tighten up under stress, and if we can measure this tightening, then we have a viable biofeedback parameter. Well, we can indeed measure muscle tension via an electrical parameter called EMG, as we'll see in Module 3. Other measurements are possible too, of course, and I'll say more about these in a few minutes. The next step is you feed back your measurement in real time, which just means that we show you the parameter as a graph on the computer screen as we measure it, so that you see the graph change as your body changes. Feedback is key to learning. When you're trying to achieve a certain outcome, feedback tells you whether you're succeeding or not. It tells you whether you're getting closer to your goal or further away. It tells you whether you should do more of the same or whether you should stop and try something different. You need feedback, whatever it is you're learning, at least anything that involves the body, and usually feedback is a natural part of the activity. So if you're learning to play tennis, when your shot goes into the net, that's feedback. Or if you mistime your shot and it doesn't feel right, that's also feedback. If you're learning to play a new tune on a musical instrument, you know when you've played a wrong note because it sounds wrong. So that's feedback. So feedback tells you the difference between what you wanted and what you actually got. And for feedback to work, your senses need to be able to perceive the difference. In biofeedback, you're getting explicit feedback about something that you could easily miss. Again, muscle tension is a helpful example, because tightening up can be very subtle, for example, in response to a subtle stressor, and you might not notice it. So biofeedback is really just accentuating what is a subtle internal feedback, and in so doing it helps you to become more sensitive to your body's internal feedback. In this way it enables learning. But it's worth saying that you won't always need biofeedback. At some stage you can grow beyond it, so it works a bit like stabilizer wheels on a child's bike. And we're going to be using biofeedback in combination with another tool, mindfulness. You're very likely to have heard of mindfulness because it gets quite a lot of publicity these days. Mindfulness is increasingly commonly used as a therapy or an element of therapy in psychological services, so therapy for anxiety and depression, etc. But it's not really fair to call it a therapy as such, because it's a tool that anyone can use. Mindfulness first evolved in the context of the spiritual practices of the East many centuries ago. It's a tool for transforming the mind. We could call it a form of mind training, and in this sense it's got a lot in common with biofeedback, though there are differences, of course. Mindfulness is associated with meditation practice, but it goes beyond meditation. You could say meditation is the formal practice of mindfulness, but you could be mindful in potentially any context of your life. Mindfulness is also a kind of mindset, and one that's really useful to bring to the context of biofeedback practice, and we'll see how later in the course. So I've said that biofeedback is a tool for learning, but there's more that we can say about how biofeedback creates change. Firstly, biofeedback creates a context for gaining insight into the mind-body connection, how emotions work, how stress affects us. The understanding that follows then frames what we can do. It comes down to understanding what works and what doesn't work, or what can work and what will never work. A lot of the time, the real problem is not quite what you think it is, but it's your effort to achieve something that's not ultimately possible. And this simply perpetuates the problem or makes it worse. And this is often the case with anxiety and stress. A common coping strategy is to prevent anxiety from arising by avoiding the potential triggers. This is never really going to work. Anxiety is a natural human emotion. It's not a disease. A better strategy is to learn to quickly recover when you do encounter triggers. Secondly, biofeedback offers a context for skills development or skills training. This is really what I was talking about in the last slide. When you engage in a challenging activity that provides feedback, then learning will happen quite naturally and spontaneously. That's what brains do, they learn. Thirdly, biofeedback can be a kind of fitness training for the brain or for the nervous system. This is a little different from learning. Suppose you regularly go to the gym and lift weights. The result is that over time your muscles are stimulated to strengthen. Let's say the day comes when you need to move some furniture at home. Because you've exercised, you can respond to the challenge quite easily. If you hadn't trained, the muscles wouldn't be prepared and things would be a lot more difficult. Well, biofeedback is like weight training for the brain and nervous system. If you exercise regularly, then when life's challenges come along, as they inevitably will, you're much better placed to respond effectively. That doesn't mean that the stress response won't happen, but your body will naturally keep it within bounds and you'll be able to recover quickly. So again, the broad aim of the course is to teach skills in regulating your own body states, or what I call mind-body skills. Now, a key part of that aim is to teach optimal breathing. Breathing is a theme that's going to be running right through the course. Why so? Well, the breath provides us an excellent context for working with the mind-body connection. How we breathe reflects how we feel and how we perform mentally, how clearly we can think and focus. Emotions affect the way we breathe, and stress affects the way we breathe. You might think that breathing is just breathing, but actually there's an incredible richness to the breath so that you can work with it without ever exhausting its potential, just going more and more deeply into the nature of the breath and into the nature of the mind-body connection. Breathing offers us a fruitful window on the mind because it's a sort of meeting ground between conscious and non-conscious or non-volitional influences, and that's what gives it such potential as a working ground for our mind-body skills development. And the connection is two-way, so we do have some volitional control over the breath, though it's not unlimited. If we can learn to intelligently apply the control or influence that we do have, then we have a means of influencing how we think, feel, and focus. Optimal breathing is a tool for developing emotional regulation, cognitive performance, and even energy and motivation. We're going to work with three main biofeedback parameters that all relate to breathing. They are firstly EMG, which is a measure of muscle tension. We've already touched on this idea that we tighten up under stress, so muscle tension biofeedback is a tool for working with the stress response. Secondly, capnometry, a means of measuring breathing chemistry, which is to do with the balance between oxygen and carbon dioxide. Capnometry biofeedback is a tool for ensuring optimal delivery of oxygen to brain cells. In my experience, dysregulated breathing chemistry is very common, and it relates strongly to stress and the kind of everyday problems that we're interested in. And thirdly, heart rate variability, or HRV. HRV gives us a window on the relationship between breathing and the autonomic nervous system, which also has a lot to do with stress. More about this shortly. So, 3 parameters, but 1 breathing training. These 3 biofeedback parameters all have their place within an integrated breathing training. Which is not to say that there's just one way of breathing well. Just as there's no single optimal mental state or emotional state, your breathing needs to change according to context. If you're giving a presentation at the office, that's going to be quite a different state of mind from lying in bed trying to get to sleep, and your breathing should reflect this. So adaptability or flexibility is key. It's the ability to shift state to most appropriately meet the needs of the circumstances that you find yourself in. Some more about how the training course works. It needs to be a practical course. I really want you to make progress with the problems that led you here, and to do that you have to take action. It's not enough just to take in information. Ultimately, you have to act differently in the problem contexts, that is, in your life. And I want to help you develop the mind-body skills that will enable that. But that takes time, energy and commitment, and it takes training. So how long does it take to acquire these skills? Well, that's a very individual thing. It depends how fast you learn, how much practice you put in, and also where you're starting from. It can be as little as 3 or 4 weeks, but it could also be some months. Indeed, it can be open-ended because you never really stop learning and growing. But that's not to say that you need biofeedback forever. So I designed the course so that you can go at your own pace. It has a modular structure. There are 5 modules, plus this introduction and then a concluding presentation at the end. Each of the modules has a number of parts. I'll explain the content of the modules in a minute. The teaching material is presented in videos, either slide presentations like this one, or videos demonstrating how to work with either software or hardware. Often the presentations end with a specific exercise. Besides these, I'm going to be suggesting that you practice with biofeedback every day, or at least most days. How many days you train before moving on to the next part, or to the next module, is up to you. You're ready when you feel like you've more or less got the particular skill under your belt. But do plan on practicing each day, as I say. Now, when I developed the course, my hope was that you could follow it at home with as little direct support as possible. In other words, to offer biofeedback training in a cost-efficient way. But that's a big ask. You'll almost certainly benefit from some personal one-to-one coaching at some level. There's no doubt that would be the best way to do it. It's just a question of how much you want to invest. So personal coaching is available. To what extent you need it and how much depends in part on the particular nature of the problems that you're working on. It also depends on your background experience. For example, if you've already done a mindfulness course, then you'll have some experience of paying attention to the body, and that's going to be helpful. So do consider getting some one-to-one support if you need it, and especially if you're feeling confused or overwhelmed at any point. As I say, there are 5 modules, and the first 2 are preparatory, while the 3rd, 4th and 5th are the heart of the course when we get into biofeedback practice. Module 1 is about setting up the project. I think it's good to think in those terms. You have certain outcomes that you want to achieve that are individual to you, at least to some extent. And the clearer you are about what your outcomes are, the better your chance of actually getting there. And goals have to be realistic. Often it's chasing impossible goals that actually constitutes the real problem. So you need to be clear on what your personal goals are, and we need to ensure that they're realistic and that the course is relevant to them. So that's what we're going to cover in Module 1. And we'll also present some models that will help you understand how to work with biofeedback. Module 2 looks at mindfulness. As I've already said, mindfulness is a kind of mind training, and there are lots of people offering courses in mindfulness, usually lasting 6 or 8 weeks. Now, I'm not going to cover mindfulness in the same way. In particular, we're not going to be doing much in the way of straight mindfulness practice. Rather, we're going to bring some elements of mindfulness into our biofeedback training. In Module 3, we finally get to biofeedback, and we'll start with EMG, or muscle tension biofeedback. EMG is a good place to start because it's relatively easy to make sense of and make progress with. It's a way of getting to know what biofeedback is all about, and at the same time giving us a good foundation to build on in terms of breathing training. In Module 4, we get onto capnometry. As I said, capnometry is about breathing chemistry, which is probably the most important element of optimal breathing because it's about ensuring optimal delivery of oxygen to brain cells. And paradoxically, the biggest obstacle to that is overbreathing or hyperventilation. And I'll be explaining why that is. Now, if you think that you don't overbreathe, I'd suggest that you hold your judgment a while because most overbreathing is a matter of degree, and most mild overbreathers have no idea that they're actually doing so. Even if you're not actually an overbreather, you can still benefit from learning to move from normal or everyday breathing into truly optimal breathing. Module 5 focuses on HRV biofeedback. It's still focused on breathing and it builds upon what we've learned, but it adds a new dimension to the feedback. You may have heard of heart rate variability because it's become well known as an assessment tool. It's a biomarker for various aspects of performance. In HRV training, we're interested in a particular pattern of variation called heart rate coherence. We'll be looking at what that is and why it's a useful thing to train. I'd like to close with a suggestion for further reading. This is my book. It's called Mind-Body Intelligence: How to Manage Your Mind Using Biofeedback and Mindfulness. So obviously it covers the same ground, much the same ground as this video course, but in a different way. The course is more practical, but the book gives more background in terms of the science underlying the methods that we're using. So I hope you'll find it interesting. At the time of recording, it's only available as an ebook, but you can download some sample chapters from my website to get a taste of it. That said, I designed the course very much as a standalone, so you don't need to read it, and certainly not right now. So we're in a position to make a start with Module 1, which is about setting up your project.